Every year, my family told me I ruined Christmas. This year, I decided not to show up at all. I did not pay for any of it either. The panicked calls started ringing right at 4 in the afternoon. I am George Bennett. I am 69 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my own flesh and blood inflicted. As a retired auto plant foreman, I survived decades of grinding labor, but nothing prepared me for the toxicity of my own home. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I ripped open the bank envelope with my bare hands. The thick paper tore down the middle, and my eyes locked immediately onto the bold numbers printed at the bottom of the credit card statement. $30,000. The charge originated from a luxury ski resort in Aspen. The sheer audacity of the number burned through my vision. I did not sit down. I did not pour myself a glass of water to calm my nerves. I picked up my phone and dialed my son. The line rang twice before Christopher picked up. I offered no greeting. I demanded an explanation for the $30,000 drawn from my account. Christopher let out a harsh breath into the receiver. His voice dripped with immediate hostility. He accused me of turning December into a nightmare every single year with my suffocating stinginess. He said I was obsessing over pennies, while the rest of the world was trying to celebrate the holidays. I stood in the middle of my kitchen and listened to the boy I raised call me a miserable miser. Christopher knew exactly how to twist the blade to inflict maximum damage. He brought up my late wife. He claimed this lavish ski trip was Martha and her dying wish. He said she wanted the family to experience true luxury at least once and told me I was betraying her sacred memory by questioning the cost. The mention of Martha felt like a physical blow to my chest. I looked down at my hands gripping the phone. The skin was rough and mapped with deep scars and permanent calluses. For 30 years, I stood on the freezing concrete floor of a Chicago auto assembly plant. I breathed in toxic metal dust and ruined my knees and sacrificed my youth so Christopher could attend a prestigious university without taking on a single dime of debt. Now he was using his mother and her grave as a shield to justify maxing out my credit line for a winter vacation. I did not scream at him. I did not remind him of the sweat and blood it took to build the wealth he was currently squandering. I simply ended the call. The silence in my empty house was deafening. I swallowed the bitter taste of betrayal and resigned myself to the quiet humiliation of being used. 15 minutes later, a sharp chime came from my computer in the corner of the living room. It was an email from Christopher. He was carelessly rushing to cover his tracks and send the flight details, but he made a fatal mistake in his arrogance. He had forwarded the entire message chain between himself and his wife, Valerie. I scrolled past the flight numbers and the luxury resort confirmations. My eyes hit the replies buried at the bottom of the thread. Valerie had written that the stingy old man was going to ruin their entire aesthetic. She explicitly complained that my cheap clothes and gloomy attitude would destroy her holiday photos. Christopher replied that she did not need to worry about my presence. He assured her they were booking me into a rundown roadside motel 3 miles away from their massive luxury cabin. But the true bomb detonated in the final line of Valerie and her response. She wrote that they just needed to endure my presence for one last trip. She explicitly stated that immediately after the holidays, they were finalizing the medical paperwork to have me committed to a care facility so they could finally take full possession of the Chicago house. The undeniable truth stared back at me from the glowing screen. The glow of the computer screen cast a sickly pale light across my darkened living room. I sat perfectly still in my worn armchair. My hand gripped the computer mouse with the same heavy force I used to grip the steel levers at the auto plant. I scrolled past the flight itineraries and the lift ticket confirmations. Christopher had meant to send only the top portion of the email to prove the trip was booked, but his careless arrogance left the entire history of his conversations with his wife attached below. The truth unfolded before my eyes, line by line. I read the itemized breakdown of the $30,000 I had just paid. It was not a shared family vacation. I had funded a 6-bedroom luxury ski lodge situated directly on the premium slopes of Aspen. I read the guest list. Valerie had invited her parents, her 2 younger sisters, and their husbands. A dozen people who had never worked a single hour of hard physical labor were preparing to sip expensive champagne and sleep in king-sized beds on my dime. I kept scrolling to find my own name. I needed to see where the father who paid for this extravagant getaway fit into their grand design. I found George Bennett buried at the very bottom of the itinerary. My accommodation was not in the sprawling mountain lodge with the rest of the family. Christopher had booked me into a rundown roadside motel 3 miles down the mountain. It was a cheap establishment situated near the highway exit, a place usually reserved for stranded truck drivers. I was expected to sleep in a cramped room with paper-thin walls and wait for a public shuttle bus to take me to the resort, just to see my own family. I had paid for a palace, and my own son had relegated me to a frozen shack. The justification for this exile was spelled out in plain text. Valerie typed her thoughts with a casual cruelty that made the blood freeze in my veins. I read her exact words twice to ensure my tired eyes were not deceiving me. She wrote that they could not possibly allow the old man to stay in the main lodge. She told my son that my presence would completely ruin the aesthetic of their holiday. She specifically complained about my wardrobe. She stated that my cheap clothes and gloomy face would destroy the pictures she planned to post on her social media accounts for her friends to see. She called me a depressing eyesore. She demanded I be kept out of sight until it was time to pay for the expensive restaurant bills at the end of the night. Christopher had replied with a simple agreement, promising his wife that he would handle me. I looked down at myself. I wore a faded plaid flannel shirt and a pair of heavy denim jeans. These were the clothes of a man who spent 30 years managing a deafening assembly line on the south side of Chicago. I stood near blistering blast furnaces and inhaled metallic dust for decades. I wore these cheap clothes so Christopher could wear tailored suits to his corporate meetings. I bought my work boots from discount bins so I could pay his university tuition in full without taking out a single student loan. I sacrificed my own comfort to build a solid financial foundation for him. Now the woman he married despised the very fabric that paid for her lavish lifestyle. She viewed the physical evidence of my lifelong sacrifice as a disgusting stain on her perfect public image. I did not scream, did not throw my coffee mug against the wall. I did not shed a single tear. The burning anger in my chest quickly cooled into a sharp and absolute clarity. The forgiving father who always made excuses for his boy died right there in front of that computer screen. I realized I was nothing more than an open wallet to them. I was a pathetic burden they tolerated only when they needed a massive bill paid. Christopher had stood in my kitchen 1,000 times, eaten the food I bought, and smiled in my face while secretly plotting with his wife to hide me away like a shameful family secret. They viewed my age and my quiet demeanor as proof of my weakness. They thought they had successfully manipulated a naive old man. My hand did not tremble as I moved the mouse to close the window, but something else caught my eye. The email thread did not begin with the ski trip. The subject lines changed as the messages dated back several weeks. They were discussing far more than holiday accommodations and social media photos. If they were bold enough to write down their plans to hide me in a cheap motel, I needed to know what else they had put in writing. I clicked on a message dated late November. I began to read a conversation that pushed my realization of their betrayal far beyond simple greed. They were not just planning a temporary exile for the winter. They were actively discussing a permanent solution for their problem, a plan that involved my home and my sanity. The cursor blinked on the screen like a metronome, marking the time I had left. I dragged the mouse down the digital pages, scrolling past in a blur of betrayal. It was not enough for them to humiliate me during the holidays. They had already mapped out the destruction of my future. Beneath the holiday itinerary lay a series of internal messages sent between Christopher and Valerie. They were not discussing ski rental packages or dinner reservations. They were discussing the systematic erasure of my life in Chicago. As I read through the cold strategy in their words, it reminded me of the narrative structure I once analyzed in Kichban Mao 1_6, where betrayal acts as a slow poison that numbs the victim before the final strike. They had been in contact with a firm specializing in geriatric psychology. Christopher had sent a forwarded thread from an associate who coached him on how to report my behavior to local medical boards. The plan was terrifyingly simple. They intended to fabricate instances of my confusion, claiming I had left the oven on or gotten lost on my way to the grocery store. They needed a paper trail of my supposed cognitive decline to satisfy the legal requirements for guardianship. Valerie wrote that it would be easy to find a doctor who would sign the papers if they framed it as a compassionate decision for a failing old man. Like the calculated malice I read in Kichban Mao Haigach, Duisao, their plan was not impulsive, but a carefully timed strike intended to strip me of my agency without a fight. I read the date on the planning document. January 15th. That was the day they had circled for the formal intervention. They intended to wait until I was exhausted from the trip, until I was far from my familiar environment and my local doctor. In the middle of the Aspen trip, while I was surrounded by the noise of their celebration, they planned to spring the trap. They wanted to strip me of my power of attorney and take legal control of the suburban house that I had spent 30 years paying for and maintaining with my own two hands. My chest felt like it was encased in a block of ice. I thought back to the dinners we had shared over the last few months. Christopher would sit across from me sipping his wine and ask me seemingly casual questions about my bank accounts or my health insurance policies. I had answered him with pride, telling him I was fine and that I kept my affairs in perfect order. I had viewed those questions as an adult son showing interest in his aging father. Now I saw them as what they were. They were interrogations. They were checking the target before the final assault. The house in Chicago was not just a piece of property to them. It was a golden ticket. It was a 4-bedroom colonial with a massive backyard and mature oak trees that sat in one of the most desirable school districts in the county. They had been eyeing it for years, always making comments about how I was too old to mow the lawn or manage the property taxes. Now they had decided they would no longer wait for nature to take its course. They had decided to manufacture my obsolescence. I stood up from the computer and walked to the window. The lights of the neighborhood were dimming as the late night settled in. For a long time I had played the role of the humble, aging father who existed only to serve their needs. I had allowed them to take what they wanted, thinking it was a form of love. I had been wrong. Love without boundaries was not love. It was an invitation for them to step on my neck. I looked at my own reflection in the darkened glass. The face looking back was not the frail old man they described in their emails. It was the face of a man who had built engines that powered half the cars in this city. It was the face of a man who knew how to identify a flaw in the system and fix it before it caused a catastrophe. They had identified me as the flaw in their financial success. They wanted to discard me to keep their machine running smoothly. I knew then that I had two choices. I could sink into the role they had carved out for me, fading away in some sterile facility while they sold my life to pay for their debts. Or I could become the very thing they were trying to prevent. I could stop being their victim and start being their problem. The quiet, compliant father was dead. In his place, a strategist was born. I sat back down at the desk and began to document everything. Every email, every timestamp, every name they mentioned. They thought they were trapping me in a box of their own design, but they had forgotten one fundamental truth. A man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous person on earth. I was ready to play this game, and I was going to play it better than they could ever imagine. They wanted to take my house. They wanted to take my dignity. They were about to learn that taking from me would cost them everything they had. I did not scream. I did not hurl the computer monitor to the floor. The cold clarity that washed over me required absolute silence. I pushed my chair back and walked out of the living room with the steady and measured pace of a man inspecting a familiar factory floor. My destination was the master bedroom. I bypassed the closet and walked directly toward the landscape painting hanging above my oak dresser. Martha had bought that painting at a local market 30 years ago. I swung the wooden frame aside to reveal the heavy steel door of the wall safe hidden behind it. I punched in the combination. The mechanical clatter of the locking bolts echoed loudly in the quiet room. I pulled the heavy steel door open. My immediate priority was the deed to the house. If they were planning to legally strip my property to pay off whatever mountain of debt they carried, I needed to ensure they had not already forged my signature to leverage my home. My rough fingers brushed past stacks of old tax returns and birth certificates until I felt the stiff parchment of the property deed. It was there. They had not taken the house yet. A brief and sharp exhale of relief left my lungs. I reached deeper into the steel cavity to check the remaining contents. My hand swept the bottom shelf. It met bare metal. I froze. I dropped to one knee and pulled the remaining envelopes out to get a clear view of the back of the safe. The space where the dark blue velvet box should have rested was completely empty. That box held Martha and her diamond jewelry set. I had purchased that necklace and matching earrings decades ago. I sold my beloved vintage pickup truck, the only indulgence I ever bought for myself, just to afford those stones for our 20th wedding anniversary. After Martha passed, I placed the velvet box in the safe with a specific and unwavering purpose. It was a sacred inheritance. I planned to give it to Christopher and his daughter, my only granddaughter, on her 18th birthday. It was meant to be a bridge between the grandmother she barely knew and the woman she would become. I grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand and shined the harsh white beam into the dark safe. The empty space mocked me. Then I saw the metal edges around the interior lock. Deep and fresh scratches scarred the steel. Someone had clumsily forced a secondary key into the mechanism. There was only one other key in existence. I kept the spare hidden inside an old rusted toolbox in the basement, a hiding spot known only to me and my son. Christopher did not just plan to lock me away in a facility next year. He had already robbed me. He had snuck into my bedroom, violated his mother and her memory, and stolen his own daughter and her inheritance. He fenced the diamonds I bought with my sweat and blood to help fund a lavish ski trip for his arrogant wife. The physical evidence of his theft erased the last remaining shred of my paternal mercy. The son I raised was gone. I was dealing with a thief. I sank onto the edge of the mattress. The springs groaned beneath my weight, a familiar sound in a suddenly unfamiliar house. My fingers traced the worn edges of the dark blue velvet box resting in my lap. It was completely empty. The plush interior where Martha and her diamond necklace and matching earrings had rested for years held nothing but a faint indentation. I did not yell. The betrayal was too immense, too absolute for something as simple as noise. I ran my thumb over the velvet feeling, the texture letting the reality of my son and his actions settle into my bones. He had stood in this room. He had looked at his mother and her things, and he had chosen greed. I remembered the day I brought that box home. I was 30 years old, working double shifts on the assembly line, coming home every night, smelling of motor oil and exhausted sweat. At the time, I owned a beautifully restored vintage Ford pickup. It was my absolute pride, the only thing I had ever bought purely for myself, something I spent my weekends polishing and tuning. But Martha deserved something that sparkled, something that proved she was cherished beyond our cramped apartment and our tight budget. I sold that truck to a collector in Detroit without a single second thought. I took the cash, walked straight into the best jeweler downtown, and bought those diamonds. I wanted her to have something permanent, something that could be passed down through our bloodline. When Martha passed away, I placed the set in the safe. It was never meant to be sold. It was an inheritance, a sacred bridge from my wife to our granddaughter. I intended to place that exact velvet box into the young girl and her hands on her 18th birthday. I wanted to tell her about the grandmother, who loved her before she could even walk. Now Christopher had stolen it. He had pried open his own family and their legacy and fenced the diamonds I bought with my blood and sweat. He traded his mother and her memory to fund a luxury ski vacation for a wife who openly despised me. He violated my sanctuary. He robbed his own daughter. The sheer calculation of it was suffocating. To steal those diamonds, Christopher had to walk into this room, look at the photographs of his mother resting on the dresser, and consciously decide that a few days of luxury in Aspen were worth more than her memory. He had to take the velvet box, feel the weight of it in his hands, and carry it out of my house while I trusted him. He had to stand in front of a jeweler and barter away a piece of our family history. He had kept the spare key hidden, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, while I sat downstairs drinking coffee, oblivious to the predator walking through my own halls. The level of detachment required to do such a thing was something I could not comprehend. I had spent my entire life trying to provide a soft landing for him, and his response was to dismantle my life piece by piece. As I sat there, in the heavy silence of the bedroom, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The sudden vibration against my leg was jarring. I pulled it out, half expecting another text from Christopher, demanding I hurry to the airport to catch the flight to Aspen. Instead, a push notification illuminated the screen. It was an automatic fraud alert from my bank. The message was brief and clinical. A withdrawal of $5,000 had just been processed. This transaction did not come from my primary credit line, the one I had just witnessed being drained for $30,000. This alert came from my secondary joint savings account. I stared at the bright white text on the screen. Decades ago, I had set up that joint account with Christopher. It was designed purely as a safety net, an emergency fund for him to access if he ever faced a severe medical crisis or a sudden layoff. I had deposited a portion of every paycheck into that account, for years building a wall of security around my son. I explicitly told him it was only for absolute disasters. Now the transaction details listed the point of withdrawal. It was a teller transaction located directly inside a high-end winter sports outfitter in downtown Chicago. $5,000 in cash. They were not facing a medical emergency. They were not avoiding foreclosure. They were buying custom-fitted skis and designer winter gear using the emergency lifeline I had spent half my life building for them. They were looting my accounts while simultaneously plotting to declare me legally incompetent. The audacity was breathtaking. They were actively draining my financial blood while holding the knife to my throat. The $5,000 notification on my phone screen felt like a final definitive verdict. It was the punctuation mark at the end of a long sentence of disrespect. I visualized them standing in that expensive sports store, swiping my debit card to buy designer jackets and goggles, laughing about how easily they were manipulating the old man. They were using my sweat to buy their vanity. They were using my love to finance their arrogance. Every muscle in my body coiled with a new, dangerous energy. For years, I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace. I had tolerated Valerie and her condescending remarks about my home. I had ignored Christopher and his constant demands for financial help. I had convinced myself that keeping the family together was worth the quiet humiliation. But seeing the empty safe and the drained bank account shattered that illusion completely. There was no family left to keep together. There were only parasites feeding on a host. I locked my phone and placed it gently on the nightstand. The numbness in my chest evaporated, replaced by a cold, burning focus. I looked around the bedroom I had shared with my wife, the home I had maintained for 30 years. Every piece of furniture, every framed photograph represented a lifetime of honest labor. They believed they were dealing with a weak, senile old man who would quietly fade away into the shadows of a nursing home. They believed they could strip my house, drain my accounts, and silence me with fabricated psychological evaluations. They thought I would simply bow my head and accept my exile to a rundown roadside motel. They forgot who they were dealing with. I was a man who spent his entire life managing chaos on a factory floor. I knew how to identify a catastrophic failure in a system, and I knew exactly how to dismantle a broken machine. The time for being a forgiving father had ended. Christopher was no longer my misguided son making a mistake. He was a threat to my survival and my dignity. I stood up from the bed. I left the empty velvet box resting on the mattress, a monument to their treason. The plan they had outlined in those emails was a declaration of war. They intended to strike in January to declare me incompetent and seize my assets while I was trapped and confused. But they had made a fatal error. They had left the blueprints to their ambush in plain sight, and they had struck too early with the theft of the diamonds. They had given me the one thing they could never take back. They had given me the element of surprise. The last drop had spilled over the edge. There would be no more second chances, no more looking the other way. I walked out of the bedroom with a singular, unbreakable purpose. It was time to cut the power to their perfect little world. It was time to let them freeze in the reality they had created. The bitter wind whipping off Lake Michigan felt appropriate for the morning I had ahead. I walked through the heavy glass doors of a downtown Chicago high-rise and took the elevator to the 42nd floor. My destination was the law firm of Stephen Black. Stephen was not a warm family counselor or a mediator who specialized in amicable resolutions. He was a legal surgeon. His reputation was built on dismantling the most vicious and complicated family frauds in the city. He was the man you hired when your own flesh and blood turned into predators. I did not wear a tailored suit to this meeting. I wore my heavy denim jacket and my scuffed work boots. I carried a thick manila folder tucked firmly under my arm. The receptionist offered me a polite smile and a cup of expensive coffee. I declined both. I was ushered into a vast office featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the frozen gray expanse of the lake. Stephen sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He looked up, his eyes immediately assessing my presence. I did not waste his time with tearful introductions or emotional pleasantries. I sat down in the heavy leather chair opposite him and opened my folder. I pulled out the printed email thread and pushed it across the polished wood. I instructed him to read the highlighted paragraphs. The room fell into absolute silence for 10 minutes. The only sound was the crisp turning of paper and the distant hum of the city traffic far below. I watched Stephen as his eyes scanned the words my son and daughter-in-law had carelessly typed. I watched him digest their detailed plan to fabricate a medical history and declare me mentally incompetent. I watched him read their complaints about my cheap clothes and their intention to banish me to a squalid roadside motel. I did not offer any verbal commentary. I let their own cruelty speak for itself. Next, I slid the bank statement across the desk. I pointed to the unauthorized cash withdrawal of $5,000 taken directly from the emergency fund I had established for my son. Finally, I placed the glossy photograph of my bedroom safe on top of the pile. The image clearly showed the fresh, violent scratches around the locking mechanism where Christopher had forced his way in to steal his mother and her diamond jewelry. Stephen aligned the documents into a neat stack. He folded his hands and leaned back in his chair. He adopted the careful, measured tone of a professional accustomed to navigating the chaotic waters of family grief. He asked me what my ultimate goal was. He offered to draft a strong cease and desist letter to put them on notice. He suggested we could demand the immediate return of the stolen funds and the jewelry under the threat of severe litigation. He asked if I wanted to bring Christopher into the office for a mediated settlement to resolve the issue quietly. I looked at this highly paid attorney and told him he misunderstood the situation entirely. Mediation was a tool designed for misunderstandings and miscommunications. A stolen diamond heirloom and a premeditated conspiracy to lock a sane man inside a psychiatric ward was not a misunderstanding. It was a declaration of war. I explained that I did not want a warning letter. I did not want a negotiation. I wanted an absolute execution of my legal rights. I leaned forward and laid out my terms with total precision. 2 years ago, after I experienced a mild dizzy spell, Christopher had sat at my kitchen table and played the role of a deeply concerned son. He had convinced me to sign a comprehensive medical and financial power of attorney. He claimed he just wanted to be prepared in case I ever needed swift medical intervention. I had signed those documents trusting my boy to make life-saving decisions on my behalf. Now armed with the knowledge of their emails, the realization of what I had done chilled me to the bone. They currently held the legal authority to dictate my health care. They possessed the exact weapon they needed to force me into a locked facility. I instructed Stephen to draft the immediate revocation of every single power of attorney bearing my signature. I demanded that the medical proxy be shredded. I demanded that the financial proxy be terminated retroactively. I wanted official certified notices delivered to my primary care physician, my bank managers, and every local hospital network in the greater Chicago area. I needed it established in stone that Christopher had absolutely no authority over my physical body or my financial assets. I told Stephen that if my son ever tried to make a medical decision on my behalf, I wanted him treated as a hostile, unauthorized stranger by the authorities. Stephen nodded slowly. The mask of professional sympathy vanished from his face, replaced instantly by the sharp, calculated focus of a legal tactician. He asked about the status of my estate. I told him to pull my current will from his firm and her archives. The document that left the Chicago house, my pension savings, and my remaining investments to Christopher was to be destroyed immediately. I instructed Stephen to draft a brand new will, cutting my son out of my legacy completely. I did not want to leave him a single cent, a single photograph, or a single grain of dust from my property. Stephen warned me of the potential backlash. He explained that sudden disinheritance, especially when combined with the immediate revocation of medical powers, often triggered aggressive legal retaliation. He pointed out the danger hidden in their emails. Christopher and Valerie were already researching ways to declare me mentally unfit. Stephen warned that my preemptive strike might push them into a corner, forcing them to file for an emergency guardianship hearing the very moment they realized their access to my money had been severed. I welcomed the fight. I told Stephen that I had spent 30 years anticipating mechanical failures before they happened on the assembly line. I knew exactly how to preempt a breakdown. I instructed him to schedule an appointment for me with the most rigorous, independent geriatric psychiatrist in the city that very afternoon. I was going to secure an ironclad certificate of mental competency before Christopher even realized the battle had begun. We were going to build an impenetrable fortress of medical evidence proving my absolute sanity. If my son wanted to stand before a judge and claim I was losing my mind, he would have to do it against the sworn documented testimony of the best medical professionals in Chicago. I spent the next 2 hours in that office signing documents. The stroke of the pen against the thick paper felt like the breaking of heavy, suffocating chains. With every signature, I was erasing decades of misplaced trust. I was reclaiming my autonomy. I was no longer the silent, sacrificing provider waiting for scraps of affection from an ungrateful child. I was a man defending his territory. I paid Stephen a substantial retainer fee in cash, refusing to use any traceable card. I walked out of the law office and stepped back into the freezing city air. The bitter wind hit my face, but I did not shiver. The fire inside me was burning hotter than ever. The first layer of their control had been completely dismantled. Now it was time to uncover the true depth of their financial desperation. Stephen Black did not ask for my permission to dig into the financial background of my son and his wife. It was standard protocol for his firm. If we were going to wage a legal war, Stephen needed to know the exact size of the enemy and the depth of their war chest. He turned his attention to his computer monitor and began typing with practiced, deliberate speed. He was accessing public records, credit histories, and property liens. I sat in the heavy leather chair across from him and watched the gray clouds roll over the freezing waters of Lake Michigan outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The silence in the office was thick and heavy, punctuated only by the sharp clicking of the keyboard. Minutes passed before the high-speed printer in the corner of the room whirred to life. It spit out several pages of dense financial data. Stephen gathered the warm papers and adjusted his glasses. He read through the top sheet carefully. His face did not register shock or surprise. A man in his profession rarely saw anything that shocked him anymore. Instead, his mouth tightened into a thin line of professional disgust. He slid the stack of papers across the polished mahogany desk toward me. He told me to look at the highlighted numbers at the bottom of the second page. I picked up the document. My eyes scanned the columns of numbers, interest rates, and outstanding balances. It was a comprehensive summary of Christopher and Valerie and their joint liabilities. I found the highlighted section at the bottom. The final tally was completely staggering. They carried exactly $120,000 in unsecured credit card debt. I read the number a second time to make certain my tired eyes were not betraying me. It was not a mortgage. It was not a business loan. It was pure toxic consumer debt spread across 7 different maximum limit platinum cards. The reality of their glamorous life began to unravel right in front of me. I thought about the tailored Italian suits Christopher always wore to our family dinners. I thought about the brand new luxury sports utility vehicle Valerie drove, the one she always parked carefully at the very edge of my driveway to avoid getting dust on the tires. I thought about the $30,000 Aspen ski lodge they had just booked for the holidays. None of it was real. Their entire existence was a carefully constructed stage play built on a fragile foundation of suffocating debt. They were drowning in a swamp of unpaid bills and exorbitant interest rates. The wealthy, successful image they projected to the world was nothing more than a hollow shell waiting for a strong wind to blow it down. Stephen leaned forward and pointed a heavy pen at another section of the report. He explained the current timeline of their financial ruin. They were 3 months behind on the mortgage payments for their downtown condominium. The bank had already issued a formal notice of default. They were weeks away from active foreclosure proceedings. Their credit limits were completely exhausted, and their bank accounts were drained. They had zero liquidity and zero assets they could leverage to save themselves. They were standing on the absolute edge of bankruptcy. The cold, sharp truth settled deep into my bones. The elaborate plan to lock me inside a psychiatric facility was not simply a matter of convenience. It was not just about getting an old man out of the way, because my faded clothes ruined their aesthetic in holiday photographs. It was a desperate, calculated act of survival. They were cornered animals. My 4-bedroom house in the suburbs was the only unencumbered asset left in our entire family. I owned it free and clear. I had paid off the final mortgage installment 10 years ago. To Christopher and Valerie, my home was not a repository of family memories or a place of comfort. It was their only available lifeboat. They needed to declare me mentally incompetent so they could seize the property, sell it for cash, and use my life savings to bail themselves out of the financial grave they had dug for themselves. A deep and bitter resentment washed over me. I remembered the condescending tone Christopher often used when he visited me. He would look around my modest living room, note my worn armchair and my simple television, and tell me I needed to upgrade my lifestyle. He treated my thriftiness as a character flaw. He viewed my blue-collar pension as something to be pitied. Yet while I slept soundly every night knowing I owed nothing to anyone, my son was lying awake in a luxury apartment he did not own, sweating over minimum payments he could not afford. The son who mocked my cheap work boots was secretly plotting to steal the roof over my head just to keep his leased cars from being repossessed. The dynamic of our relationship shifted permanently in that quiet law office. For years, I had walked on eggshells around Christopher. I had always tried to accommodate his busy schedule. I had absorbed Valerie and her subtle insults because I believed they were successful, busy people who were simply losing patience with an aging man. I had felt small in their presence. Now, looking at the printed proof of their pathetic reality, I felt nothing but a towering, cold authority. They were not successful. They were frauds. They were con artists trying to pull off one final heist against the easiest target they could find. Stephen broke into my thoughts to outline the strategic implications of this new information. Because Christopher was financially crippled, a protracted legal battle over my mental competency would be difficult for him to sustain. High-powered lawyers required massive retainers. Court battles required endless cash. But Stephen also issued a grave warning. Desperation makes people incredibly dangerous. A man who is about to lose everything will take massive, reckless risks to save himself. Christopher might seek out predatory loans or find a corrupt attorney willing to work on contingency just to secure a piece of my estate. We could not underestimate him simply because he was broke. A cornered thief will fight with everything he has left. I closed the folder and rested my hands flat on the desk. I told Stephen that we would not wait for them to fight. We were going to dismantle their ability to strike before they even knew the war had started. The revocation of the power of attorney was just the first step. I wanted to build a wall of financial and legal protection so high and so thick that Christopher would break his hands trying to climb it. I instructed Stephen to establish a revocable living trust immediately. I wanted the deed to my house, the balance of my pension, and every single dollar in my bank accounts transferred into that trust by the end of the week. I would be the sole trustee while I was alive and capable. If anything ever happened to me, control would pass directly to an independent corporate fiduciary. Christopher would never be able to touch a single blade of grass on my property. Stephen offered a cold, efficient smile. He understood exactly what I was doing. By placing everything inside a trust, I was completely removing my assets from the probate process. Even if Christopher miraculously managed to find a judge willing to listen to his fabricated stories of my dementia, there would be no assets left in my personal name for a legal guardian to control. The vault would be empty. The lifeboat they were desperately trying to reach would already be gone, locked safely away behind impenetrable legal walls. I stood up from the leather chair. The initial shock of the betrayal had passed. The grief over losing the son I thought I had raised was buried deep beneath a layer of iron resolve. I was going to let Christopher and Valerie face the exact consequences of their unchecked greed. I was going to let the banks take their luxury cars and their expensive condominium. I was going to let their glamorous facade shatter into a million pieces, and I was going to make absolutely certain that my lifelong sacrifice would never be used to clean up their pathetic mess. I stepped out of the high-rise building and pulled my heavy denim jacket tight against the bitter Chicago wind. The meeting with Stephen Black had armed me with the exact legal weapons I needed. I did not head toward the train station to go back to the suburbs. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address for the central branch of my bank. My mind was a steel trap. For decades, I had poured my sweat and my overtime pay into those accounts. I had built a fortress of financial security for my family. Now, the very people I built it for were trying to use it as a weapon against me. The cab ride was a blur of gray buildings and freezing rain. I thought about Christopher and Valerie in Aspen right now. They were likely sipping hot cider and trying on the expensive ski gear they had purchased with the $5,000 they stole from my emergency fund. They felt invincible. They felt untouchable. They had no idea that a wrecking ball was heading straight for their glass house. The central bank branch was an imposing structure of polished marble and vaulted ceilings. It was a place designed to make ordinary people feel small. I walked through the heavy revolving doors with the steady steps of a man on a mission. The security guard eyed my faded jeans and scuffed work boots with a hint of suspicion. I ignored him and walked straight to the main reception desk. The young woman behind the counter offered a practiced and shallow smile. She asked how she could help me today. I placed my identification on the counter and told her I needed to speak directly with the senior branch manager immediately. She glanced at my worn clothes and politely suggested I take a number and wait for a standard teller. I did not raise my voice. I simply tapped my calloused finger on my identification and told her to type my name into her system. I told her I was not there to deposit a small paycheck. I was there to restructure millions. She frowned, but complied. The moment my account profiles loaded onto her screen, her entire demeanor shifted. The shallow smile vanished. The dismissive tone evaporated. She stood up quickly and personally escorted me to a massive glass office at the back of the building. The senior branch manager was a man named Arthur. He wore a tailored suit that likely cost more than my first car. He stood up and offered a firm handshake, welcoming me to his office. He tried to engage in polite small talk, asking about the weather and my day. I did not indulge him. I sat down in the plush leather chair and placed my rough hands flat on his immaculate desk. I told Arthur that we were going to conduct a complete and total overhaul of my financial portfolio, and we were going to do it before I left the room. I explained that there had been unauthorized breaches in my trust, and I was immediately severing all secondary access to my wealth. Arthur nodded slowly, opening his laptop to pull up my extensive file. He asked me where I wanted to begin. I started with the credit lines. Years ago, when Christopher graduated from college, I had opened 2 premium secondary credit cards in his name linked directly to my primary account. I had told him they were for emergencies, only to help him establish his own solid credit score. Instead, he and Valerie had been quietly treating those cards as their personal slush fund. They were currently using them to finance their lavish lifestyle and mask their mounting mountain of consumer debt. I looked Arthur directly in the eye and instructed him to freeze those cards immediately. I did not want them suspended pending a review. I wanted them permanently canceled. Arthur tapped his keyboard. He informed me that the cards were currently active and had been used just an hour ago at an exclusive resort restaurant in Colorado. A sharp, bitter satisfaction flared inside my chest. I pictured Christopher and Valerie sitting at a candlelit table ordering expensive wine and imported steaks. I imagined the exact moment the waiter would return to their table holding a declined card. They would try to laugh it off as a bank error. They would try the second card. It would decline as well. The humiliation they had planned to subject me to was about to be served back to them home on a silver platter in front of their wealthy peers. Arthur confirmed the cancellation. The plastic in their wallets was now entirely worthless. The next step was the joint savings account. This was the account Christopher had just raided for $5,000 to buy ski gear. It was an account I had funded with my overtime pay from the deafening assembly line. I told Arthur I wanted every single penny withdrawn from that account immediately. I wanted the balance brought to absolute zero and the account closed permanently. Arthur blinked in surprise. He noted that there was over $400,000 resting in that specific fund. He cautioned me against moving such a large sum of liquid cash without a phased strategy. I told him my strategy was already in motion. I was not leaving a single dime where my son could reach it. Christopher believed that declaring me incompetent would give him the keys to this exact vault. I was making sure that when he finally broke the door down, he would find nothing but air. Arthur processed the transaction. The digital numbers on his screen dropped to 0. The emergency fund I had woven with 30 years of labor was completely dissolved. Finally, we reached the most critical phase of the operation. The money I had just pulled from the joint savings along with my personal investment portfolios needed a secure new home. I handed Arthur a sealed envelope provided by Stephen Black. Inside were the routing numbers and official legal directives for the newly established Irrevocable Living Trust. I instructed Arthur to wire the entire sum of my liquid assets directly into that trust account immediately. I explained that this trust was managed by the top-tier legal firm I had just retained. The money was no longer in my personal name. It was locked behind a legal fortress constructed by men who destroyed fraudulent family claims for a living. Arthur carefully initiated the wire transfers. I watched the progress bar on his screen fill slowly. With every passing second, the financial chains tying me to my ungrateful son were breaking. If Christopher and Valerie wanted to access my wealth now, they could no longer just forge a signature or trick a sleepy bank teller. They would not be fighting a tired old man in a cheap flannel shirt. If they wanted a single dollar of my money, they would have to step over the dead bodies of the most ruthless and expensive attorneys in Chicago. And considering the fact that they were currently drowning in $120,000 of credit card debt, they could not even afford the parking fee at Stephen Black and his law firm. The transfers were finalized. Arthur handed me a thick stack of printed receipts confirming the total restructuring of my life. I folded the papers and placed them securely in the inner pocket of my jacket. I thanked Arthur for his efficiency and walked out of the glass office. The bank lobby looked exactly the same as when I had entered, but my world had fundamentally changed. I was no longer a victim waiting for the axe to fall. I had just dismantled their entire future, and they had absolutely no idea. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped out into the freezing Chicago afternoon. I breathed in the icy air deeply. It tasted like pure, absolute freedom. The morning light filtering through the frost-covered windows of my suburban home felt different. For 30 years, this house had been my sanctuary, a physical manifestation of my sweat and labor on the assembly line. I had repaired every leaking pipe, painted every wall, and mowed the sprawling lawn week after week. Now, as I walked through the quiet hallways, I viewed the property not as a home but as a tactical asset. I needed to liquidate it immediately. The firm of Stephen Black had secured my legal and financial boundaries, but the house remained a glaring target. Christopher and Valerie were banking their entire financial survival on this property. They needed it to clear their massive consumer debt. I was going to ensure that when they reached for that lifeline, their hands would grasp nothing but empty air. I did not contact a traditional real estate agent. I could not afford the luxury of a prolonged process. Open houses for sale signs planted in the front yard, and nosy neighbors would easily alert Christopher to my actions. I needed absolute secrecy and relentless speed. I reached out to a corporate firm that specialized in purchasing residential properties for direct cash. Their business model was simple. They offered fast liquidity in exchange for a significant discount on the market value. When the corporate evaluator arrived at my front door, he walked through my home with a cold, calculating eye. He noted the solid foundation, the updated roofing, and the premium location within the school district. He offered me a figure that was exactly 20% below the fair market value. 30 years ago, losing 20% of my home equity would have devastated me. I had worked double shifts just to afford the initial down payment. But standing in my living room today facing the man in the sharp suit, I felt no hesitation. That 20% was not a loss. It was the price of my immediate freedom. It was the fee I gladly paid to sever the final chain binding me to a son who viewed me as nothing more than a disposable resource. I accepted his offer on the spot. I presented only two non-negotiable conditions. The first was that the transaction had to close entirely within 3 days. The second was a formal leaseback agreement. I stipulated that a portion of the sale proceeds would be used to legally rent the house back from the corporation until the very end of January. The evaluator agreed without missing a beat. The paperwork was drawn up with ruthless efficiency. Within 72 hours, the title of the house I had owned for 3 decades was quietly transferred to a faceless holding company. The massive wire transfer bypassed my local bank entirely and flowed directly into the impenetrable trust managed by Stephen Black and his team of attorneys. The trap was now perfectly set. By executing the leaseback agreement, I ensured that everything looked exactly the same from the outside. The property taxes were paid. The utilities remained active in my name. When Christopher and Valerie returned from their lavish Aspen vacation, they would drive past this house and see everything just as they left it. They would initiate their malicious plan to declare me incompetent, believing they were about to steal a fortune. They would have no idea that they were attempting to seize a property that legally belonged to a corporate conglomerate. They were fighting for a ghost, with the legal and financial architecture of my departure firmly established. I began the physical process of erasing myself. I did not hire moving trucks. I did not pack dozens of cardboard boxes. I walked into the master bedroom and pulled a single small leather suitcase from the top shelf of the closet. I packed only the absolute essentials. I folded a few changes of light, comfortable clothing, my daily medications, and the vital documents identifying my new trust accounts. I left the heavy winter coats hanging on their racks. I left the vintage tools in the garage. I left the expensive television and the worn armchair in the living room. I was abandoning the accumulated weight of a life that no longer served me. I arranged the house to look like a paused life. I left a half-empty coffee mug resting in the kitchen sink. I placed a pair of old slippers neatly by the front door. I draped a discarded sweater over the back of the dining chair. To anyone looking through the windows, it appeared as though the owner had just stepped out to fetch the morning newspaper and would return at any moment. It was the ultimate decoy. I was leaving them a perfect hollow museum of the man they thought they could easily manipulate. The morning of December 23rd arrived with a brutal, biting cold that swept off Lake Michigan and rattled the window panes. It was the day I was supposed to quietly submit to my exile. My phone buzzed aggressively against the kitchen counter. The harsh vibration broke the morning silence. I picked up the device and looked at the illuminated screen. It was a rapid succession of text messages from Christopher. He was barking instructions with his usual arrogant impatience. He commanded me to make sure I did not miss the airport shuttle. He reminded me to pack the cheap thermal wear because he was not going to buy me new gear at the resort. He ended the barrage of messages by telling me to stay out of the way once I arrived at the discount motel, reiterating that they had a very tight holiday schedule to maintain. I stared at the glowing words. A month ago, reading those dismissive commands would have filled me with a quiet, hollow sadness. I would have made excuses for his tone, telling myself he was just stressed from his demanding career. Today, I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional tether had been cleanly severed. I saw his messages for what they truly were. They were the desperate, controlling barks of a man who thought he held all the cards, completely blind to the fact that the casino had already burned to the ground around him. He thought he was directing a weak old man toward a freezing roadside shack. He did not realize he was talking to a ghost. I did not type a reply. I did not offer an explanation or a bitter farewell. Silence was the most powerful statement I could leave behind. I walked over to the kitchen trash can. I held the smartphone over the dark plastic bin. The screen lit up one final time with another impatient question mark from my son. I opened my hand and let the device drop. It landed softly among the damp coffee grounds and discarded packaging. The screen glowed dimly in the garbage for a few seconds, before fading into complete darkness. The last tether was gone. I picked up my small leather suitcase by the handle. I walked out the front door and engaged the deadbolt, listening to the heavy metallic click echo in the freezing morning air. I walked down the driveway toward the waiting taxicab. The driver loaded my bag and asked for my destination. I told him to head straight for O'Hare International Airport. When we arrived at the sprawling, crowded terminals, I did not head toward the gates servicing the outbound flights to Colorado. I bypassed the crowds of people hauling heavy skis and thick winter parkas. I walked toward a different concourse entirely. I handed my boarding pass to the attendant and stepped onto a one-way flight headed straight down the eastern seaboard. I took my seat by the window as the jet engines roared to life. As the plane lifted off the icy tarmac, climbing higher through the gray winter clouds, I looked down at the shrinking geometry of Chicago. I was leaving the bitter cold. I was leaving the suffocating betrayal. I was heading toward the warm, tropical breeze of Key West, Florida. My new life had just begun, and the people who tried to destroy me were about to step into a freezing void of their own creation. The warm morning sun of Key West washed over the wooden planks of my private balcony. It was a kind of heat I had not felt in decades, the sort that seeps directly into your bones and melts away the stiff, lingering ache of 1,000 freezing Chicago winters. I sat in a woven rattan chair, listening to the rhythmic, soothing crash of the ocean waves against the distant shoreline. The bitter wind of the Midwest, along with the heavy burden of my son and his relentless demands, belonged to a different lifetime. I raised a white ceramic mug to my lips and took a slow sip of black Cuban coffee. Its rich, dark flavor perfectly matched the clarity of my new existence. Resting on the circular glass table, directly in front of me, were two items. The first was a brand new smartphone purchased with cash at a local electronics store just hours after I landed in Florida. It contained no saved contacts, no history, and absolutely no connection to Christopher or Valerie. The second item was a heavy silver stopwatch. I reached out and pressed the small steel button on the top. The mechanical hand began to sweep across the circular face with a quiet, steady ticking sound. I leaned back in my chair and watched the second hand move. I was not timing a race. I was timing a demolition. 2,000 miles away, nestled high in the snow-covered peaks of Aspen, Colorado, a very different morning was unfolding. I did not need a hidden camera to see it. I knew my son and his wife with the precise, predictable certainty of a mechanic who understands how a flawed engine operates. I knew exactly where they were and exactly what they were doing. They were sitting in the grand, opulent lobby of the luxury ski resort I had unknowingly financed. The cathedral ceilings soared above them, framed by massive timber beams and immense windows that showcased the pristine, powdery slopes. A roaring fire crackled in a stone hearth the size of a small house. Christopher was holding court on a plush leather sofa, surrounded by Valerie and her extended family. They were completely insulated in a bubble of stolen wealth. Valerie would be wearing the designer winter gear they had purchased with the $5,000 Christopher siphoned from my emergency savings account. She would be ordering expensive mimosas for her parents and sisters, laughing loudly, and taking endless photographs to broadcast their fabricated success to the world. They felt invincible. They felt that they had successfully navigated a minor inconvenience and emerged victorious. That inconvenience, of course, was me. They were undoubtedly celebrating my absence. In their minds, the fact that I had not arrived in Aspen was not a cause for alarm. It was a magnificent, unexpected gift. They probably assumed I had missed my flight due to my supposed old age and confusion. They likely laughed about how I was probably wandering around the airport terminals bewildered and lost, or sitting in that cheap, depressing roadside motel, waiting for a shuttle bus that would never arrive. My failure to appear meant they did not have to suffer the embarrassment of my cheap flannel shirts. It meant Valerie did not have to hide her displeasure when I spoke. It meant they could consume the luxury I had paid for without having to look the source of that wealth in the eye. They believed they had the perfect holiday. They had the palace, they had the champagne, and the ugly, inconvenient old man was completely out of the picture. I imagined Christopher leaning back against the leather cushions, feeling like an absolute king. He had the power of attorney paperwork safely tucked away in his briefcase. He had the schedule for the medical intervention locked in his calendar. He thought he had completely outsmarted me. He believed that the second he returned to Chicago, he would snap the trap shut, force me into a care facility, and take possession of my 4-bedroom house to wipe out his mountain of credit card debt. He thought the $5,000 he stole was just a small advance on his inevitable inheritance. He had absolutely no idea that the house he planned to sell currently belonged to a corporate real estate conglomerate. He had no idea that his inheritance had been legally incinerated. I watched a seagull glide effortlessly through the clear blue Florida sky. I checked the silver stopwatch on the glass table. It was approaching 10 in the morning in Aspen. The initial rush of their morning celebration would be winding down. The mimosas would be finished. The large, extravagant breakfast they had ordered for 12 people would be cleared away. Soon, the smiling waiter would approach Christopher and present him with a leather folder containing the bill for their morning indulgences. Christopher would not even look at the total. He would simply reach into his tailored jacket, pull out his platinum credit card, and drop it onto the silver tray with a casual, arrogant flick of his wrist. He would flash a confident smile at Valerie and her parents, silently reinforcing his role as the wealthy, generous provider. The waiter would bow his head, take the leather folder, and walk back toward the service station to process the payment. I took another sip of my dark coffee. The warmth spread through my chest, chasing away the last lingering ghosts of my old life. For 3 years, I had quietly absorbed their insults. For 3 years, I had watched them treat my hard work as a bottomless wishing well. I had endured the subtle eye rolls, the heavy sighs of impatience, and the blatant disrespect because I believed that family required endless sacrifice. I had been a fool, but I was a fool no longer. The man who allowed himself to be treated like an open wallet had died in the cold Chicago winter. The man sitting in the Florida sun was a completely different entity. I knew exactly how the digital systems operated. When the waiter swiped that platinum card through the machine, the request would shoot through the network, seeking authorization from the primary account. It would hit the solid, impenetrable wall erected by my bank manager. The network would return a single merciless code. The transaction would not be delayed. It would not prompt a request to contact the bank. It would be hard declined. The account was closed. The credit line was dead. The financial umbilical cord had been severed with a rusted saw. I looked at the stopwatch again. The second hand ticked forward with relentless precision. 1 minute left. In Aspen, the waiter would be standing at the terminal, frowning at the error message on the screen. He would run the card a second time, assuming a simple magnetic strip failure. The machine would beep aggressively, printing out a small slip of paper bearing the denial code. The waiter would place the useless piece of plastic back into the leather folder and begin the long, uncomfortable walk back to Christopher and his waiting family. The majestic snow-covered peaks, the roaring fire, and the crystal champagne flutes were about to transform from a symbol of their triumph into the staging ground for their absolute humiliation. They had built their entire empire of arrogance on a foundation of my money, and I had just detonated the pillars holding it up. I closed my eyes and let the ocean breeze wash over my face. I did not feel any sadness for my son. I did not feel any regret for the brutal reality he was about to face. I had given him every tool he needed to build an honorable life, and he had chosen the path of a thief. Now he was going to learn the hardest lesson of his life in front of the very audience he had tried so desperately to impress. The silence on my sunlit balcony was profound and perfect. It was the beautiful, heavy silence that always immediately precedes the storm. The heavy brass pendulum of the grand lobby clock swung back and forth, finally striking 4 in the afternoon. The deep, resonant chime echoed across the vaulted timber ceilings of the exclusive Aspen ski resort. Christopher stood up from the plush leather sofa, smoothing the front of his tailored cashmere sweater. He rolled his shoulders, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The flight had been seamless. The complimentary champagne had been excellent. His wife Valerie sat nearby, laughing softly with her mother, while her father admired the panoramic view of the snow-covered peaks. They were all waiting for Christopher to perform the final ritual of the afternoon. He was about to secure the keys to a magnificent 6-bedroom villa, cementing his status as the wealthy, capable patriarch of their extended family. He walked toward the long marble reception desk with the confident, arrogant stride of a man who believed the world owed him absolute luxury. The resort manager, a tall man with perfectly groomed gray hair and a sharp suit, stood waiting behind the counter. He offered Christopher a polished, professional smile. The manager welcomed him to the resort and gently placed a thick black leather folder on the marble surface. He opened it to reveal the final invoice. It detailed the luxury villa rental, the private chef retainer, the lift tickets for 6 adults, and the premium equipment rentals. The total outstanding balance required for immediate clearance was $35,000. Christopher did not even blink. He did not read the itemized list. To look too closely at the numbers would imply that cost was a concern. He wanted Valerie and her parents, who were watching him from across the lobby, to see a man totally unbothered by such an immense figure. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a heavy metal platinum credit card. The card bore his name, but it was directly linked to the deep, unencumbered financial reserves his father had built over 30 grueling years on an assembly line. Christopher viewed that money as his own personal birthright. He placed the heavy card on top of the invoice and pushed it back across the marble counter with a casual flick of his wrist. The manager picked up the card, his face a mask of polite indifference. He inserted the metal chip into the payment terminal. Christopher turned slightly, catching Valerie's eye and offering her a reassuring wink. He leaned against the counter, waiting for the familiar sound of the receipt printing. Instead, the terminal emitted a sharp, flat beep. The manager looked at the small digital screen. He tapped a button, waited a second, and then slowly removed the card. He placed it back on the marble counter, sliding it carefully toward Christopher. The manager kept his voice perfectly modulated low enough so that the surrounding guests could not hear. He apologized and stated that the transaction had been declined. Christopher let out a short, dismissive chuckle. He picked up the card and turned it over in his hand. He told the manager that it was simply an overly aggressive fraud protection algorithm. He explained confidently that his bank often flagged large out-of-state transactions, especially in resort towns during the holidays. He reached back into his jacket pocket, fully intending to resolve the minor inconvenience. He pulled out a second premium card, the direct backup also drawing its lifeblood from his father's primary accounts. He handed it to the manager, telling him to process the charge on the second card, while he made a mental note to reprimand his banking representative later. The manager took the second card. The silence at the marble counter stretched out. Christopher drummed his fingers against the stone, feeling a slight prickle of irritation. Across the lobby, Valerie stopped talking to her mother. She noticed the delay. Her father also turned his attention toward the reception desk, his eyes narrowing slightly. The seconds felt heavy. The terminal processed the request. Then the same sharp, flat beep echoed from the machine. The manager removed the second card. This time he did not slide it back immediately. He looked directly into Christopher's eyes, and the polite, accommodating demeanor of a hospitality professional vanished, replaced by the firm, immovable boundary of corporate policy. He informed Christopher that the secondary card had also been declined. Christopher felt the blood rush to his face. The irritation flared into genuine anger. He raised his voice just a fraction, demanding that the manager run the numbers again. He insisted there must be a fault in the resort's payment system. He stated loudly that there were hundreds of thousands of dollars backing those accounts. The manager shook his head slowly. He turned the payment terminal slightly so Christopher could see the digital readout. The manager explained that the system was not returning a standard fraud alert code. A fraud alert would prompt a request to call the bank for verbal authorization. The code displayed on the screen was absolute. It indicated a hard closure. The manager stated with chilling clarity that both accounts had been permanently terminated by the primary account holder. Christopher stared at the glowing red letters on the screen. The air in his lungs suddenly felt thin. The manager continued, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the lobby like a razor. He noted that the terminal timestamp indicated the accounts had not been frozen today. They had been completely deactivated and locked 72 hours ago. 72 hours ago. The timeline hit Christopher with the physical force of a swinging hammer. 3 days ago. That was exactly when he had sat in his father's modest kitchen, condescendingly telling the old man to pack cheap thermal underwear for his banishment to a discount motel. That was the day he believed he had set the final pieces of his trap in motion. A cold, suffocating dread began to crawl up his spine. The sudden realization was paralyzing. His father had not been confused. His father had not been docile. While Christopher was arrogantly barking orders, the old man had been quietly and surgically dismantling his entire financial existence. Valerie's heels clicked sharply against the stone floor as she approached the desk. She asked what the problem was, her tone laced with the impatient entitlement she always carried. She looked from the manager to Christopher, waiting for her husband to clear the obstacle. Christopher opened his mouth, but his throat was completely dry. He looked down at the two useless pieces of plastic resting on the marble counter. They were dead. The limitless well of his father's money had been capped and sealed in concrete. The manager, sensing the rapidly deteriorating situation, maintained his professional stance, but his eyes grew cold. He addressed Christopher directly, ignoring Valerie's rising demands for an explanation. He stated that the resort required an immediate valid form of payment for the $35,000 balance. Without cleared funds, he could not release the keys to the villa, nor could he authorize their continued presence in the private guest lounge. Valerie's father walked over, stepping up beside his daughter. He asked Christopher if there was a financial issue. The older man's gaze was piercing, stripping away the glamorous facade Christopher had worn for years. The wealthy father-in-law was looking at a man who suddenly seemed very small. Desperation clawed at Christopher's mind. He reached into his wallet and pulled out his own personal credit cards. These were the cards tied to his failing business ventures, the ones already choked with the toxic weight of $120,000 in hidden debt. His hands shook visibly as he handed the first one to the manager. He prayed for a miracle. He prayed the bank had missed a limit or that a pending payment had somehow cleared. The manager ran the card. Declined. Insufficient credit limit. Christopher handed him another. Declined. Maximum balance exceeded. Valerie let out a sharp gasp. Her mother covered her mouth. The father-in-law stood perfectly rigid, his face turning into a mask of pure disgust. The carefully constructed illusion of Christopher's success shattered into a million jagged pieces right there in the lobby. He was not a wealthy executive treating his family to a luxury vacation. He was a bankrupt fraud standing at a counter he could not afford to lean against. The manager gathered the rejected cards and handed them back in a neat stack. He signaled discreetly to two large security personnel standing near the grand fireplace. The manager informed Christopher that since no valid payment could be secured, the reservation was officially canceled. He politely but firmly asked the family to gather their luggage and vacate the premises immediately. Christopher stood paralyzed. The roaring fire in the hearth suddenly felt like ice. The opulent surroundings mocked him. He looked at his wife, whose face was pale with shock and mounting fury. He looked at his in-laws, who were already stepping away from him, as if he carried a contagious disease. He had planned to execute a flawless, ruthless takeover of his father's life. Instead, he found himself standing in the ruins of his own, stripped of his money, his pride, and his future. The silence of the old man he had so deeply underestimated was now deafening. The tropical breeze rolling off the Gulf of Mexico was a stark contrast to the freezing winds of Chicago. I sat on my sunlit balcony in Key West, watching the turquoise water stretch endlessly toward the horizon. A tall glass of iced tea rested on the table beside my brand-new smartphone. I had spent the morning walking along the beach, feeling a profound sense of peace. The heavy weight of the last 3 years had completely vanished from my shoulders. The constant anxiety of trying to please an ungrateful son was gone. Then the digital chime of the phone broke the silence. Stephen Black and his team had set up a secure forwarding line just as we had planned. I looked at the bright screen and saw my son calling. The moment of absolute reckoning had finally arrived. I let the phone ring 4 times to center my thoughts before pressing the green button to accept the call. Christopher did not offer a greeting. He practically shouted into the receiver. His voice was a frantic mix of absolute panic and his usual arrogant entitlement. He demanded to know what was wrong with my bank accounts. He told me he was standing in the lobby of a luxury ski resort in Aspen, and every single credit card had been severely declined by the management. He ordered me to call the bank manager immediately and authorize the release of the funds. I could hear the echoing acoustics of the grand resort lobby in the background of the call. I could hear the faint murmur of wealthy guests and the clinking of expensive glassware. Christopher complained that Valerie was deeply humiliated in front of her parents. He stated that the resort manager was threatening to cancel their massive villa reservation and kick them out into the snow if they did not provide a valid form of payment immediately. He spoke to me not as a father, but as an incompetent employee who had failed to execute a simple task. He commanded me to fix the situation instantly. I listened to his frantic demands without interrupting. A year ago, his panic would have triggered my own deep anxiety. I would have scrambled to call the bank and apologize for the inconvenience. I would have sacrificed my own dignity and drained my savings to ensure his absolute comfort. I would have believed his lies about bank errors and temporary holds. Today I felt nothing but a cold and solid resolve. I waited until he ran out of breath and the heavy silence stretched over the cellular connection. When I finally spoke, my voice was lower and steadier than it had been in decades. I told him there was no mistake with the banking system. I informed him with perfect clarity that the accounts were permanently closed and the credit lines were completely dissolved. Christopher let out a harsh and desperate laugh. He told me to stop playing foolish games. He insisted that I was confused and that my old age was clearly affecting my memory. He tried to revert to his usual manipulation tactic of making me doubt my own mind. He told me I was having a senior moment and that I needed to listen to him very carefully for my own good. He warned me that if I did not fix the problem immediately, he would fly back to Chicago and take legal control of my finances to protect me from myself. He threatened me with the very weapon I had already dismantled. He told me I was forcing his hand and leaving him no choice but to declare me unfit. I took a slow sip of my iced tea. The condensation on the glass was cool against my skin. I told him he would have a very hard time taking control of assets that no longer belonged to me. I explained that my entire estate was now locked inside an irrevocable trust managed by the most ruthless corporate attorneys in Chicago. I informed him that the house in the suburbs had been sold to a corporate real estate conglomerate and that he currently had zero access to any of my legacy. I heard his breath catch in his throat. The background noise of the Aspen lobby seemed to fade away as he absorbed the magnitude of his ruin. Before he could formulate another lie or attempt another threat, I delivered the final, devastating blow. I recited the exact words Valerie had carelessly typed in her email just a week ago. I told him I sincerely hoped they could find a vacancy at that squalid roadside motel 3 miles down the highway. I reminded him that they had specifically researched that motel because it was incredibly cheap and completely out of sight of their wealthy friends. I quoted their exact plan to dump me in a cheap room while they enjoyed the luxury of the resort. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. The arrogant bluster evaporated instantly into the thin mountain air. Christopher finally realized the terrifying scope of his reality. He realized I had seen the emails detailing their conspiracy. He realized I knew all about their plan to declare me incompetent and steal my home. Most importantly, he realized I knew the exact truth about their $120,000 of secret consumer debt. He stammered, trying to formulate an excuse, trying to claim it was a massive misunderstanding. His voice broke as the gravity of his situation completely crushed him. He was standing in a luxury lobby with no money, no credit, and no future. The wealthy image he had projected to his in-laws was actively burning to ashes around him. He began to beg. The son who had treated me with nothing but condescension for years was now pleading with me over a cellular connection. He begged me to reconsider. He pleaded for a small transfer just to pay the resort manager and save him from total public humiliation. He asked me to send enough money to get them out of Aspen and back to Chicago. He called me Dad for the first time in years with genuine desperation. He promised he would change and that they would pay me back every single cent. I looked out at the beautiful blue ocean stretching endlessly before me. I told him that an adult must face the consequences of his own financial decisions. I reminded him that he had spent years pretending to be a massive success while secretly draining my life savings. I suggested he ask Valerie and her parents to cover the massive resort bill, since they were supposedly so successful and wealthy. I told him I was no longer his safety net or his victim. I stated that he was completely on his own. I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the glass table. I did not block his number. I simply turned off the ringer and let the device sit in the warm Florida sun. The storm in Aspen was just beginning. Christopher was about to face the resort manager, the security guards, and the harsh judgment of his furious in-laws. He was about to learn the true cost of his arrogance and his endless greed. I picked up my coffee mug and took another slow, relaxing sip. My sky in Key West was perfectly clear, and my new life was finally my own. The silence on the line shifted heavily. The frantic begging from my son evaporated into a thick and palpable terror. Christopher realized I was not offering a negotiation. He tried to pivot his strategy. He tried to use his polished corporate boardroom voice. He stammered that I was overreacting to a simple email vent between him and his wife. He claimed the comment about the roadside motel was just a bad joke taken entirely out of context. He asked me to be reasonable. He told me that family members often say things they do not mean when they are stressed. I cut him off before he could build any momentum. I told him there was no context in this world that justified planning the systematic mental destruction of a sane man. I told him his apologies were entirely worthless because I knew exactly what drove his actions. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not holiday stress. It was absolute sheer desperation. I let the silence hang for a second to ensure he was listening to every single syllable. I told him I knew about the $120,000 in unsecured credit card debt. I heard a sharp intake of breath on his end. The bustling resort lobby in Aspen must have felt like a collapsing tunnel to him in that exact moment. I listed his financial failures with clinical precision. I mentioned the missed mortgage payments on his downtown condominium. I mentioned the maximum limits on the platinum cards he was currently trying to hand to a confused resort manager. I told him I knew his entire life was a hollow shell painted gold. He had spent years looking down at my simple clothes and my quiet life while he was actively drowning in a swamp of unpaid bills. I told him I was perfectly aware that my life savings were his only remaining lifeline. He was planning to sacrifice my freedom and my dignity just to keep the bank from taking his luxury cars. Christopher tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He sounded like a cornered animal trying to find a way out of a burning room. He managed to whisper that he was going to pay it back. He said he had a new business deal on the horizon, and he just needed a little more time to make things right. I told him a thief does not get time. I shifted the conversation away from the banks and directed it toward the master bedroom of my home. I asked him if he thought I was completely blind. I asked him if he honestly believed I would not notice the violent, deep scratches around the locking mechanism of my personal wall safe. I spoke the name of his mother. I spoke Martha and her name with a cold, calculated fury. I told him I knew he had forced the safe open while I was out of the house. I knew he had stolen her vintage diamond jewelry to pawn for quick cash. I told him I had the high-resolution photographs of the damaged lock and the formal appraisal of the missing pieces resting securely in a file with my attorney. The theft of a family heirloom was not a financial misstep or a temporary loan. It was a cowardly and disgusting betrayal. It was a crime against the woman who had given him life. I told him that pawning his mother and her memory to pay for a ski trip was the exact moment he ceased to be my son. He was completely broken now. The man who had strutted through life demanding respect and demanding money was openly sobbing into the receiver. He pleaded with me to let him come back to Chicago. He said we could sit down in the living room and sort this out together as a family. He promised he would check himself into a financial counseling program. He swore he would drop the arrogant act. He said he would bring Valerie and they would stay in his old childhood bedroom until they got back on their feet and figured out a way to repay the debts. He begged for the safety of the house he grew up in. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I looked at the endless blue horizon of the Florida coast. I told him he could not return to his childhood bedroom. I told him he could not sit in my living room to sort this out. I explained with absolute and terrifying clarity that the house no longer belonged to me. I let that statement hang in the air. I heard him stop breathing entirely. I explained the timeline to him so he would understand the absolute finality of his situation. I told him that while he was busy packing his bags for his Aspen vacation, I was sitting across a mahogany desk from a corporate real estate buyer. I informed him that I had sold the property for cash. I sold it at a 20% discount to guarantee a rapid 3-day closing period. I told him the deed had already been officially transferred to a commercial holding company. The 4-bedroom suburban house he was banking his entire future on was permanently gone. I told him the massive wire transfer from the sale had bypassed my personal accounts entirely and was currently locked inside an irrevocable trust managed by a team of highly aggressive lawyers. I laid out the brutal reality of his failed conspiracy. I told him I knew everything about the psychiatric evaluation he was secretly trying to schedule for me. I knew about the corrupt plan to declare me incompetent before a judge. I knew they intended to lock me in a nursing home facility and use their power of attorney to liquidate my estate and steal the equity of the house. I told him their filthy plan required 2 specific things to work. It required an isolated old man and a vulnerable physical asset. Now they had neither. I told him I was 2,000 miles away sitting in the warm sun, and the house was a corporate asset they could never legally touch. Christopher let out a low, agonizing moan. It was the sound of a man watching his entire existence evaporate. He had no leverage left. He had no backup plan. I told him he was standing in the lobby of an expensive resort with a $35,000 bill he could not pay. I told him he had no house to return to in Chicago because his own mortgage was in severe default, and the locks on my old property had already been changed by a corporate landlord. I told him his safety net was completely incinerated. He had treated me like a disposable resource for years. He had valued his wealthy image over his own flesh and blood. He had stood by while his wife mocked my boots and planned my institutionalization. Now he was going to experience exactly what it felt like to have absolutely nothing. He was going to have to look his wealthy in-laws in the eye and admit he was a total fraud. He was going to have to find his own way out of the freezing mountains. I did not wait for a response. I did not want to hear another fabricated apology or another desperate plea for mercy. I had delivered the final judgment. The quiet life I had built was fully protected, and the financial prison he had built for himself was finally locking its doors. I lowered the phone from my ear and pressed the screen to end the call. I set the device on the glass table next to the stopwatch. The ticking sounded like a victory march. I closed my eyes and listened to the ocean. The line went completely quiet for a fraction of a second before a sudden scuffle echoed through the receiver. I could hear the desperate rustling of clothing and a sharp, muffled curse from Christopher. Then a new voice pierced the digital connection. It was Valerie. She had snatched the phone directly from her husband. Her voice was not trembling with the same defeated realization that had just crushed Christopher. Her voice was vibrating with pure, unfiltered venom. She possessed the dangerous kind of arrogance that blinds a person to their own destruction. Valerie had always viewed me as an inconvenient stepping stone. She was a woman accustomed to intimidating retail workers and browbeating service staff to get exactly what she wanted. She clearly believed she could use that same aggressive tactic to force a 70-year-old man back into submission. Valerie began to scream into the phone. She abandoned any pretense of familial affection or polite negotiation. She demanded that I reverse the sale of the house and wire the funds back to their accounts immediately. When I remained completely silent, she resorted to the final desperate card she had left in her hand. She threatened me with the absolute destruction of my autonomy. She shrieked that my actions over the past few days were undeniable proof of a severe mental breakdown. She claimed that selling my lifelong home at a massive discount and fleeing across the country were the textbook actions of a man losing his grip on reality. She told me she was going to call the Chicago police the very moment she hung up. She swore she would file an emergency injunction to have me declared a profound danger to myself and my own estate. She painted a horrifying picture of what she intended to do. She promised to hire the most ruthless private psychiatrists in the state. She told me they would testify under oath that I was suffering from an acute manic episode and advanced dementia. She said she would drag me back to Illinois in a straitjacket if necessary. She threatened to lock me inside the darkest, most secure ward of a state-run nursing facility where no one would ever hear from me again. She insisted that a judge would look at my sudden financial liquidation and instantly grant her and Christopher total emergency conservatorship. She screamed that I was destroying family assets and that she would use the full weight of the legal system to strip me of every fundamental human right I possessed. I listened to her unhinged threats while watching a small white boat drift lazily across the turquoise waters of the Gulf of Mexico. I did not feel the icy grip of panic that she so desperately wanted to instill in me. I did not feel the urge to defend myself or argue against her vicious accusations. Instead, a strange and wonderful sensation bubbled up from deep inside my chest. It started as a quiet chuckle and quickly blossomed into a deep, resonant laugh. I laughed out loud into the receiver. It was not a bitter or sarcastic sound. It was the genuine, uncontrollable laughter of a man who suddenly realizes he is completely untouchable. My laughter stopped Valerie dead in her tracks. The shrieking ceased abruptly. I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as she tried to comprehend why the old man she was threatening with permanent institutionalization was laughing at her. I let the sound of my amusement fade into the warm ocean breeze before I finally spoke. My voice was no longer the soft, accommodating tone of a father trying to keep the peace. It was cold, heavy, and sharp as a scalpel. I told Valerie that her threats were as completely empty as her bank accounts. I informed her that she was wildly overestimating her own intelligence and vastly underestimating mine. I explained that I had anticipated their exact strategy the very moment I read her careless emails. I told her that I had not simply run away in a blind panic. I had executed a flawless, preemptive strike. I instructed her to listen very closely because I was only going to explain the reality of her situation once. I told her that on the exact same day I revoked their power of attorney, I spent 4 grueling hours in the office of the most respected independent geriatric psychiatrist in the entire city of Chicago. I detailed the rigorous cognitive testing, the psychological evaluations, and the comprehensive memory exams I had willingly submitted to. I told Valerie that the chief of psychiatry had issued an ironclad sworn medical certificate proving my absolute perfect mental competency. I informed her that this undeniable medical evidence was not just sitting in a doctor's filing cabinet. It had already been formally submitted to the county court by Stephen Black and his team of corporate litigators. It was a matter of permanent legal record. I told her that if she tried to bring a hired doctor into a courtroom to challenge my sanity, she would be laughed out of the building. I invited her to stand before a judge and argue that my financial decisions were irrational. I told her the judge would look at my perfectly protected trust and then look at her $120,000 of toxic credit card debt and quickly determine exactly who in our family was suffering from a severe detachment from reality. Valerie tried to interrupt me. She tried to stammer out a defense, but her voice was rapidly losing its sharp edge. The paralyzing fear was finally beginning to penetrate her arrogant armor. I did not let her speak. I had one final devastating truth to deliver. I told her that my legal strategy was not merely defensive. I was not just building a wall to keep them out. I was actively bringing the fight directly to their front door. I told her that while she was busy shouting threats over the phone, Stephen Black was busy filing formal paperwork with the authorities. I explained that Stephen had compiled a massive dossier of their financial activities over the past 3 years. He had documented the unauthorized withdrawals from the joint savings account. He had tracked the fraudulent charges on the secondary credit cards. He had secured the official appraisal and the photographic evidence of the forced entry into my master bedroom safe. I told her that the theft of Martha and her diamond jewelry was not a simple civil dispute. It was a felony. I informed Valerie that my legal team had officially filed a comprehensive criminal complaint for severe elder financial abuse. I told her that the local authorities and state investigators were already reviewing the evidence. They were not looking at a minor family misunderstanding. They were looking at a premeditated criminal conspiracy to to defraud a senior citizen. I advised her to stop worrying about what nursing home she was going to lock me in and start worrying about how she was going to afford a robust criminal defense attorney. I told her that the extravagant lifestyle she had built on my back was completely over. The banks were coming for her cars. The mortgage lenders were coming for her condominium. And the legal system was coming for her freedom. I told Valerie that this was the absolute last time she would ever hear my voice. I told her that any future communication, any desperate pleas or empty apologies, would have to be directed to the reception desk of Stephen Black and his law firm. I promised her that Stephen did not take calls from numbers associated with severe financial default. I did not wait to hear her reaction. I did not want to listen to the inevitable sound of her breaking down. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the button to terminate the connection. The digital screen went completely dark. I placed the phone flat on the glass table next to the ticking stopwatch. The demolition was officially complete. The silence that followed was not heavy or filled with tension. It was the absolute, pristine silence of total liberation. I leaned back in my rattan chair and closed my eyes. The warm Florida sun bathed my face. The sound of the crashing waves washed away the last remnants of my past. I was a man who had walked through a terrible fire and emerged completely unburned. I took a deep breath of the salty ocean air, knowing that for the rest of my life I would never have to look back. The manager's polite veneer was completely gone. He signaled to the two large security guards flanking the massive stone fireplace. They moved forward with immediate, unquestionable authority. The manager informed Christopher that attempting to secure a $35,000 luxury rental with dead accounts was considered intentional fraud in the state of Colorado. He gave them exactly 2 minutes to gather their belongings and exit the premises before he dialed the local police department. Valerie's mother let out a sharp cry of indignation. She clutched her designer handbag against her chest, as if she were being robbed in a back alley. Her father's face turned a dangerous apoplectic shade of purple. He demanded that Christopher fix this immediately, his voice echoing off the vaulted timber ceilings. Christopher could only stare blankly, completely paralyzed by the sudden absolute loss of his power. The security guards did not wait for his response. They stepped into the center of the family group and firmly gestured toward the heavy glass exit doors. The other wealthy guests in the lobby stopped their conversations. They lowered their champagne flutes and watched the spectacle with unabashed, silent judgment. Christopher felt the burning weight of their stares. He was being marched out of the very palace he had intended to conquer, escorted out like a common thief. The heavy glass doors slid open, and the brutal aspen winter slammed into them. The temperature hovered in the single digits, and the wind whipped violently across the pristine, snow-covered driveway. The security guards stood silently just inside the heated lobby, watching as Christopher Valerie and her parents dragged their heavy leather suitcases onto the freezing concrete. The glass doors shut behind them, locking them out of the warm, golden glow of the resort. Christopher shivered violently in his thin cashmere sweater. He had not packed a heavy winter coat. He had assumed he would be stepping directly from a heated luxury SUV into a heated 6-bedroom villa with valets handling his luggage. He had told his father George to pack cheap thermal underwear for a discount motel. Now the biting wind was cutting right through his expensive, useless clothes. The poetic justice of the freezing cold was absolute. He was standing in the exact desolate reality he had so meticulously designed for the man who raised him. Valerie dropped the handle of her suitcase. It hit the icy pavement with a sharp, hollow crack. She turned to Christopher, her face contorted with a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated rage. She demanded to know what was happening. She screamed over the howling wind, asking how his father could possibly shut off their entire financial existence. She had spent the last 2 years convincing Christopher that George was a weak, easily manipulated old man. She had curated the narrative that his father was simply a placeholder for their inevitable wealth. Christopher stepped back and raised his hands in a defensive gesture. He yelled back that Valerie was the one who insisted on this extravagant trip. He reminded her that she was the one who demanded the private chef and the slopeside villa to impress her parents. He told her he had warned her about the mounting credit card debt months ago, but she had refused to stop buying designer clothes and booking expensive dinners. The carefully constructed facade of their perfect marriage shattered instantly under the pressure of the freezing wind and empty pockets. Valerie stepped closer, her eyes flashing with venom. She threw the blame directly back at him. She reminded him that it was his absolute responsibility to secure the power of attorney. She screamed that he was a coward who could not even manage to outsmart an old man in a suburban house. She pointed at her shivering parents and demanded to know how they were supposed to get back to Chicago. She reminded Christopher that their return flight was not booked for another 7 days. They had no airline tickets, no rental car, and absolutely no access to cash. Christopher frantically pulled his wallet from his pocket. He dug his freezing fingers into the leather folds and pulled out exactly $42 in wrinkled cash. $42. That was the entirety of his liquid assets. It was not even enough to cover a taxi ride back to the regional airport, let alone purchase 2 last-minute flights to Chicago. He stared at the green paper as the reality of his absolute poverty sank into his bones. Valerie snatched the cash from his hand, her expression twisting into a sneer of pure disgust. She mocked the meager amount, holding it up against the backdrop of the luxury resort. She demanded to know what he planned to do with $42 in Aspen. She reminded him that he had promised her a life of total security. She had married a man she believed was the sole heir to a highly lucrative estate. She shrieked that she had wasted the best years of her life on a man who was actually completely broke. Christopher felt his own rage finally boil over. He yelled that he had drained his father's accounts just to keep up with her ridiculous standards. He brought up the massive wedding they had thrown, a wedding financed entirely on secret loans and stolen credit because she refused to have a simple ceremony. He reminded her of the leased luxury cars sitting in their driveway, back home cars they were already 3 months behind on paying. He told her that her insatiable greed was the reason he had resorted to stealing his own mother's jewelry from the safe. The mention of the jewelry made Valerie freeze for a fraction of a second. She knew exactly where the money for this trip had come from, but hearing it spoken aloud in the freezing parking lot stripped away her last layer of deniability. She quickly recovered and refused to take any responsibility. She yelled that securing the funds was his job regardless of the method. She told him he was a complete failure as a husband and as a man. Valerie's father finally spoke, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. He told Christopher that he was a pathetic excuse for a provider. He grabbed his wife's arm and grabbed his suitcase, stating that they were going to find a taxi and handle their own travel arrangements. He looked at his daughter, telling Valerie that she had tied herself to a sinking ship and walked away into the blowing snow without looking back. Christopher watched them leave. He was alone in a freezing parking lot with a furious wife and a mountain of luggage he could no longer afford to transport. The isolation was profound. He had spent years pushing his father away and treating George's unconditional support as an endless, unearned resource. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of wealth, using his father's hard work to prop up his own arrogance. Now the foundation was gone and the collapse was total. He looked at Valerie, who stood shivering and glaring at him, and realized that without the money, there was absolutely nothing left holding them together. The bitter cold of the mountains was nothing compared to the freezing reality of his new impoverished existence. 2 months slipped by with the quiet efficiency of a falling leaf. The dramatic explosion in the mountains was over, and the cold, harsh reality of the aftermath had firmly settled in. In the sterile, brightly lit corridors of the downtown bankruptcy court, Christopher and Valerie officially surrendered. Their signatures on the Chapter 7 filing were the final nails in the coffin of their fabricated empire. The luxury condominium they had treated like a fortress of success was now sealed shut by the bank. A neon orange foreclosure notice was taped to the heavy oak door. The designer cars were repossessed. The premium credit accounts were written off as massive corporate losses. The life they had built entirely on the foundation of my stolen wealth was reduced to a stack of humiliating legal documents. I did not read this in the local newspaper. I did not hear it through the neighborhood gossip. I heard it directly from Stephen Black. I sat in his immaculate glass-walled office overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city stretched out below us, totally indifferent to the financial ruin of two greedy individuals. Stephen sat across the polished mahogany desk from me. He placed a thick stack of envelopes on the space between us. They were not official legal correspondences. They were personal letters written on cheap-lined paper. Some of the envelopes were wrinkled and warped, indicating they had been stained with tears. Stephen looked at me with his usual guarded professionalism. He informed me that Christopher and Valerie had been delivering these letters to the reception desk almost daily. They had been repeatedly turned away by the security staff, but they persisted in dropping the envelopes into the mail slot. Stephen asked me how I wanted to proceed. He offered to file an aggressive harassment injunction to force them to stop the deliveries completely. I reached out and picked up the top envelope. My name was written in Christopher's frantic, messy handwriting. The letters were slanted and desperate. I did not need to open the envelope to know exactly what was written on the pages inside. I knew the exact rhythm of their manipulation. The letters would undoubtedly begin with sweeping, dramatic apologies. Christopher would claim that losing everything had finally opened his eyes to the error of his ways. Valerie would write about how much she missed our family dinners, completely fabricating a history of warmth that never actually existed. Then they would play their final and most cowardly card. They would bring up the child. Stephen informed me that the receptionist had briefly skimmed one of the open letters before flagging it. Valerie was apparently pregnant. They were using the concept of an unborn grandchild as a psychological weapon. The letters pleaded with me not to let my own flesh and blood grow up in poverty. They begged me to open my heart and my wallet for the sake of the next generation. They painted a picture of a broken family that could only be healed by my immediate financial intervention. I held the envelope in my hands, feeling the cheap paper against my fingertips. A year ago, the mere mention of a grandchild would have broken my resolve completely. I would have rushed to their side, blinded by the biological imperative to protect my family line. I would have opened my checkbook and allowed the cycle of abuse to begin all over again. I would have sacrificed the rest of my peaceful years to ensure that child had the luxury they demanded, but I was no longer that man. The man who could be emotionally blackmailed had died the moment I realized they were planning to lock me in a psychiatric ward to steal my home. I looked at Stephen. The silence in the office was thick and heavy. I did not speak a word. I simply turned in my leather chair and reached toward the heavy-duty paper shredder sitting next to the mahogany desk. I pressed the green power button. The machine hummed to life with a low, steady mechanical growl. I fed the first envelope into the metal teeth. The shredder caught the paper and pulled it downward violently. The frantic apologies, the empty promises, and the calculated manipulation were instantly reduced to thin, meaningless strips of white confetti. I picked up the next envelope and fed it into the machine. I did not hesitate. My hand was perfectly steady. I processed the entire stack of letters one by one. The sharp grinding noise of the steel blades echoed against the glass walls of the office. I watched the physical manifestation of their desperation get entirely destroyed. I felt no cruelty in my actions. I felt no vindictive joy. I only felt a profound sense of clarity and absolute justice. I was executing a necessary boundary. When the final envelope disappeared into the machine, I pressed the button to turn it off. The sudden silence in the room was beautiful. I turned back to face Stephen. He was watching me with an expression of quiet respect. I told my attorney that an apology born from an empty bank account is completely worthless. I explained that true remorse requires an understanding of the pain you have caused, not simply a panic over the money you have lost. Christopher and Valerie were not sorry for trying to destroy my life. They were only sorry that their plan had failed and left them homeless. I stated that using an unborn child as a bargaining chip to access a trust fund was the ultimate proof that their toxic nature remained entirely unchanged. I instructed Stephen to reject any future correspondence immediately and return it completely unopened. I told him that my door was permanently closed. If Christopher wanted to be a father, he would have to learn how to provide for his child through his own honest labor, just as I had done for decades. He would have to learn the crushing weight of responsibility without a safety net to catch his fall. I stood up from the comfortable leather chair and buttoned my jacket. I thanked Stephen for his exceptional work and shook his hand. I walked out of the glass office and stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed and I descended toward the bustling city streets, I realized my journey was finally complete. I had severed the rotten branches of my family tree. I had reclaimed my wealth, my dignity, and my future. I walked out into the crisp Chicago air, a completely free man, ready to live the rest of my life exactly on my own terms. The soft white sand of Key West felt warm and grounding beneath my bare feet. I walked slowly along the shoreline, letting the rhythmic wash of the evening tide erase my footprints as quickly as I made them. The blazing Florida sun was beginning its slow, dramatic descent toward the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the beach. For the first time in an incredibly long time, my chest did not feel tight. The persistent, suffocating anxiety that used to grip my lungs every time my phone rang had completely evaporated. I breathed in the clean, salty ocean air and felt a profound, overwhelming sense of calm settle into my bones. The frantic, desperate noise of Chicago and the endless, suffocating demands of my son felt like they belonged to another lifetime entirely. I had not sold the house out of malice, and I certainly had not done it to hoard wealth in my final years. Money had never been my ultimate goal. It was merely a tool representing decades of hard work and honest physical labor. I wanted that money to serve a purpose that actually meant something real and enduring. Working closely with Stephen Black, I had taken a significant portion of the funds from the real estate sale and established a secure, anonymous educational trust. The trust was specifically designed to provide full scholarships to young men and women who were working their way through trade schools and community colleges without any family financial support. I wanted to reward the exact kind of raw, genuine effort that Christopher had always mocked and looked down upon. I wanted to help young people who understood the true value of a dollar earned through sweat rather than a dollar demanded through arrogant entitlement. Knowing that the life savings I had built with Martha would be used to lift up honorable, hard-working youth gave me a deep and quiet satisfaction. The money was no longer a toxic asset waiting to be plundered by greedy hands. It had been transformed into a quiet instrument of genuine good. There was no glorious, triumphant feeling of revenge in my heart as I walked along the water. I did not sit on my balcony and gloat over the financial ruin of my son and his wife. The reality of the situation was much more sobering and profound. I felt a lingering, distant sorrow for the sweet boy Christopher used to be before the toxic blend of unearned luxury and supreme arrogance had completely consumed him. But that sorrow was no longer my anchor. I had learned the hardest and most valuable lesson of my entire life. You cannot save people who are actively determined to destroy you for their own convenience. True parental love does not mean offering yourself up as an endless sacrificial lamb on the altar of your child's greed. By cutting Christopher and Valerie off completely and permanently, I had not committed an act of cruelty. I had executed an act of profound self-preservation. I had surgically removed a relentless cancer from my daily orbit. They had chosen their path of deceit and manipulation, and I had simply allowed them to finally experience the natural consequences of walking down that road. I stopped walking and stood still at the edge of the water, letting the cool ocean foam wash over my ankles. I realized with a sudden sense of wonder that my physical posture had fundamentally changed over the last 2 months. I was no longer hunching my shoulders as if bracing for the next passive-aggressive insult or the next urgent financial demand. I stood tall and straight. My hands, which used to tremble with nervous exhaustion when I opened my bank statements, were now perfectly steady. The physical toll of enduring years of emotional manipulation had been immense, but the human body possesses a miraculous ability to heal once the source of the daily poison is completely removed. I felt healthier, lighter, and more vital at 70 years old than I had felt in my entire 60s. I looked out at the vast open expanse of the Gulf of Mexico. The sky was transforming into a magnificent sweeping canvas of deep violet, brilliant orange, and burning crimson. It was a spectacular and breathtaking sunset. Valerie and Christopher had spent their entire adult lives chasing synthetic beauty. They desperately wanted country club memberships, designer labels, and expensive exclusive addresses to prove their worth to strangers who did not actually care about them. They lived their entire lives trapped inside a hollow echo chamber of their own vanity and mounting debt. Standing here completely alone on a public beach wearing a simple linen shirt and rolled-up trousers, I possessed more genuine wealth than they could ever possibly comprehend. I had reclaimed my name. I had reclaimed my history and the honorable memory of my late wife. Most importantly, I had reclaimed my absolute unbroken dignity. I no longer had to measure my words to avoid an argument. I no longer had to hide my own preferences to accommodate their manufactured high society standards. I was entirely and unapologetically myself. The evening breeze picked up carrying the faint, distant call of a seabird heading back to its nest. I closed my eyes and simply let the deep silence wash over my face. It was not an empty or lonely silence. It was a rich, vibrant, and fulfilling peace. For years, my home in Chicago had been filled with the stressful, demanding clatter of a fake family. I had silently endured the subtle eye rolls, the heavy sighs of impatience, the forced holiday dinners, and the constant underlying hum of their calculated greed. All of that toxic noise was finally completely gone. It had been severed at the very root and tossed away into the past where it belonged. There were no more lies left to uncover. There were no more secret credit card debts to pay. There was no more walking on eggshells in my own living room. There was only the present moment and the vast, beautiful, open future stretching out ahead of me. I opened my eyes and watched the very last sliver of the golden sun dip below the horizon line. The soft purple twilight settled gently over the tropical island. I turned away from the water and began the slow, peaceful walk back to my new home. The only sound accompanying me was the steady, eternal, and completely honest rhythm of the crashing waves. The true lesson of this story is that wealth is not measured by the luxury you project, but by the integrity you maintain in your heart. When a relationship is built entirely on a foundation of greed and financial exploitation, it will inevitably collapse the very moment the money disappears. Greed blinds people to their own deep vulnerability, causing them to severely underestimate those they actively abuse. Ultimately, the very traps we build out of malice for others often become the exact prisons we find ourselves locked inside permanently. If this story resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to the channel for more powerful life lessons.